All right, students, welcome to 14.1.2. Right after Lincoln becomes president, again, we're leading right into the Civil War, and we're actually going to get to the opening stages here today. So let's just jump right on into it because we got a lot to cover. All right, so on March 4th, 1861, this is when we finally get rid of Buchanan, who's completely and totally ineffective and does nothing to prevent the Civil War from basically starting, up until the point that when he allows this seizure of federal government assets in the South, that he surrenders even $500,000 in gold in the New Orleans Mint. So, as you can see, Buchanan, in and of himself, helped fund and supply the Southern troops inadvertently because of his inaction and actions within his own cabinet. So what we have now, though, is Lincoln finally takes office. And Lincoln, he calls initially again for negotiations to bring the South back. But at the same time, in the State of the Union address that he presents when he is elected and being sworn in, not his State of the Union, his inaugural address. When he's brought in, he openly tells everybody, and he says explicitly that no states have the right to leave the Union, that they're a brotherhood and a compact, and therefore they must stay together in order to be successful. So he rallies against, and he tells the South in pretty much no uncertain term that you need to come back to the Union. Now, at the same time, Lincoln is not willing to commit military force in order to make that happen. He does not want to be seen as the aggressor that starts the Civil War. Instead, he wants the South, if they are going to initiate military action, they are the aggressors. Famously, if you look at the Lost Cause interpretation of the Civil War, that is basically the pro-Southern view of the Civil War that some Civil War historians still, even to this day, possess. They, even in the South, they call the war of Northern aggression, even though Lincoln explicitly, again, said that if war was to happen, it was going to happen on the South's terms, that the Union was not going to invade the South and send troops down there unless provoked and attacked. And there was opportunities, of course, for the South to attack the Union because there was still multiple military bases in the South. There were also government storehouses. There was also offices for the federal government down in those regions that had not been turned over into Southern control. But again, Lincoln does not want to send an army down there to show that he is the aggressor in this war. So once again, Lincoln was even to the point that he was looking at even establishing a constitutional convention to see if somehow they could come to some sort of agreement over the issue of slavery. But again, the South refused to do so. So here's his dilemma. As you can see, they've taken everything. We just really went over that, but they've taken pretty much all federal items in storehouses, warehouses, custom offices, duty offices. Again, they even took over a whole mint. One thing, though, of course, the South didn't have down there was any foundries to make cannon. So they were missing some pretty key critical infrastructure elements that would have allowed them to be able to wage war. That's why they needed to take Union forts and take Union storehouses and take it. And so they have military weaponry available to them in order to fight. So one of the forts that they have is Fort Sumter, and that is in the Charleston, South Carolina harbor. Now, initially there's 3 forts in that area, and the one in the center is Fort Sumter. There was another fort off to the side that was still in Union hands, but it was clear that they did not have enough troops to be able to hold it. And so Major Alexander needed to shore up his ability to try to hold at least one fort, and that was Fort Sumter. And so he brings all of his men, all the material, all the supplies, all the cannon into the center part where the center fort is, which is Fort Sumter. As soon as he does so, the Confederates take both forts on either side, and they start to man them with cannon and look to set up a siege of Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter is way undermanned. I think, if I remember correctly, it's about 70 men that were inside the fort itself. And I read a book once all about the Battle of Fort Sumter, and you can read about how these men were, their cannons, they're missing about at least half the cannons that should have been supplied in the fort. The fort was still like on the closing stages of construction, so it wasn't fully in order yet. So they were forced to hand tow huge cannons up to the top to the rampart areas in order to man the cannons and be able to put up some sort of defensive measure against the Southern cannons that were facing at it, right at them and in their face. One of the issues, though, is not just was there a lack of military supply, but there was even a lack of food. Now, Buchanan at one point had tried to send a supply ship to Fort Sumter, but it was chased off by Southern artillery guns. Lincoln, again, he actually sends a letter to the governor of South Carolina, and he says, hey, look, I'm not sending men, I'm not sending guns, but I am sending food and clothing to the people, to the troops in Fort Sumter. We are not doing anything that is in an aggressive nature. We're not trying to beef up the military capacity of the fort. We're just trying to take care of the men inside. And this is what leads to this is what leads to a standoff. As Lincoln's boat gets closer and closer, somebody needs to act. If the South allows the supply ship to get in, it will give enough food again to allow people in Fort Sumter to control the fort. And pretty much if you control the fort, you control the Charleston Harbor. So the South has to make a decision as to what they're going to do with Lincoln. Lincoln basically, this is what they call a strategic political move. He makes the decision that he's going to supply them no matter what. He's not going to pull the troops out because that would be showing surrender. That'd be showing that he was weak in the eyes of the South. He wanted to still put on a strong front, but again, he wanted to hold to the ideal that he is not going to send troops again. He wants to say, if you want to start this war, that's on you. You're going to have to fire the first shot. That's why, again, he sends more of a peace envoy ship down there. So what happens is the Confederate, they go, all right, well, if they resupply, we're not going to hold the Charleston Harbor. If we don't act, then our Articles of Confederation, our new government, doesn't exist if we're going to allow federal troops to be resupplied on our soil. So in order to end this finally, Major Anderson, who is in Fort Sumter, ends up fighting General PGT Beauregard. Yes, that's how you say it. Beauregard. Anderson actually taught Beauregard artillery when they were together in, if I remember correctly, they were both in West Point. So it was basically mentor versus student. However, the student had the vast superiority of men, equipment, and firepower, and that he was able to basically shell Fort Sumter for 36 hours. And Anderson really tries to fight back. There's a few times where they try to even escape and abandon the fort, all without success. And eventually, the bombardment becomes too much. There's not enough supply. Eventually, the fort would be taken no matter what. So Anderson, he decides that he is going to go ahead and surrender the fort. Miraculously, even though it was a massive shelling and a massive bombardment, no person died on either side in the opening engagement of the Civil War. This would be probably the last battle where it seemed like nobody was going to die. The Civil War is the bloodiest war in American history. And you have to understand population numbers. That is a massively violent and deadly war between them. So this is the kickoff point of the American Civil War. The Confederates fire first. They attack a Union fort. They do what Lincoln had said that would have to happen before he was ready to engage and send troops. As soon as Fort Sumter happens, Lincoln decides it's time to raise an army, and he calls for 75,000 volunteers to be raised up and ready to go to invade the South. So once this happens, though, you have to remember not every state had committed to the South yet, and not every state had committed to the Northern cause. The incident at Fort Sumter forced states to finally officially choose a side because troops were about to be moved through no matter what. One way or another, troops were coming. You were going to have to pick a side. So in the South, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina all officially join the South, the Southern cause. And then Virginia, they were a bit torn for a little bit, but then they do make the determination that they are also going to join the South. And kind of as a persuasive measure and also to show the importance of holding Virginia, the Southern capital was moved to Richmond, Virginia. And when we were talking about the South at times not necessarily seeing themselves as aligning directly with the Confederacy. Yes, they were joining the Confederacy. They believed in the Confederate cause. But more often than not, you had people align themselves based upon their state. And why do I say this? Well, Lee initially was offered the job of commanding the Union Army. So Robert E. Lee was actually approached and asked to command the Union Army. Once Virginia seceded, Lee basically stated that he was a Virginian first, and so he was going to go and defend his state. That is why the army that Lee commands is the Army of Northern Virginia. He is not commanding the Confederate Army per se. He is commanding a state army for the most part that was made up by lots of volunteers throughout the entire Confederacy. But people down in the South really were aligned and fighting for their state causes. Remember when we talked about all those young guys who were joining up without slaves anyways, but they were fighting in the defense of their state? That's what the idea here is. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the South itself with their military equipment and uniforms. One thing that have always been historically interested in is weapons of war. So those who took my Weapons of World War II class would be aware of that. But I've always been fascinated with the study of weaponry used in war. And then secondarily, something I've always loved studying is uniforms in war. And so when you look at the Civil War, there is the famous blue versus gray. That's what they always talk about, the blue versus the gray. In fact, you'll see movies even called The Blue and the Gray. And so it's historically understand from a basic level that the North wore blue and the South wore gray. To an extent, there is truth to this, but at the same time, there is also mistruth about this. If you ever want to, maybe I'll try to put a link to it if somebody reminds me. But there is a really fascinating YouTube video, and it's about 30 minutes long. It's broken into two parts, but they really go over uniforms of the Civil War, and to see what what the different sides, what the North and the South wore, is really interesting to see what they were wearing and why they were wearing it and how varied the uniforms of the Civil War were. It created a lot of problems on the battlefield, especially very early on in the war too, because there was no defined uniform for the most part for either side when things kicked off. Gray was mainly adopted because that was the color of West Point, which a lot of the commanders of the Southern Army were part of, but also you have areas like the Virginia Military Academy and other groups that were also wearing gray. So gray becomes just kind of standardized for the South based upon their military heritage. Now, again, there's no formal uniform when the war first starts, so you actually have Union soldiers that show up from these military schools wearing gray. You also have Southerners who show up in the opening stages of the war wearing blue sometimes, which creates issues on the battlefield, and you have many friendly fire incidents. So let's talk really quickly here about the gray uniforms. Okay, so for the most part, if you had money and you had the means, you wore the gray uniform. You will almost always see the general officers wearing a gray uniform. And the Confederates tended to show their ranks on their sleeves. So if you were looking for a general officer, if you were to look at the sleeves of their jacket, that's where a lot of their ranks were. But also they had it on their collar too. So like if you look at Robert E. Lee or Johnston, when you look at these men, you'll usually see the rank also on their collar, which will be like a star if they're a general. But another portion of the rank was found on the sleeves of the uniform. More often than not, you saw men who fought for the South that were from the lower classes that weren't very rich. They would wear pretty much brown. So those gentlemen over here on the side wearing brown, that was actually a more standard color. It was called butternut, and it's based off of dyeing clothing using butternuts. That would be the color. It's just a brown color that they would dye their clothes in. That's what their wives would dye for them so that they would have a uniform or at least some clothes to wear out on the battlefield. And I know you're looking at one of those guys going, well, he's barefoot. You'd be surprised how short supplied boots were in the Southern Army. So if they were to capture a Union supply train, the very first thing many of them tried to raid was the boot wagon to make sure that they had something to put on their feet. When we look at how Confederate soldiers are talked about, if you were to read diaries or newspaper articles, different accounts of the war, you often hear them called rebels. You have them called Johnny Rebs, Confederates. So there's a number of different terms that are used. Another thing, if you want to ever look into it and study it too, you can look into battle flags. They're unique for each unit from each state that they come from. There's something usually made in the town by the women of the town to represent the town's unit. They were highly prized and highly valued on the battlefields. It also allowed for units to be differentiated on the battlefield too. Try to prevent some friendly fire casualties when you're marching a straight line of men that's sometimes 2,000 feet long, if not longer. All right, let's look at the North. Okay, so historically, we know the North wearing blue. Now, what makes up the North? Well, those are the 23 states that remain. West Virginia breaks away from Virginia and forms its own state and joins up with the Union. When we talk about the North, when we talk about the Civil War, more often than not, they're going to be called the North or the Union. One thing, though, that they're also going to be called when you're looking at it from a military perspective, if you're reading military letters, military action reports, you're more often than not going to hear that the Northern Army is going to be referred to as the Federals. They're called that quite frequently. Within Northern uniforms, they typically wore blue, typically. Now, you have units, especially like up in the New York area, they have a group called the Zouaves, and they wear kind of these baggy uniforms with kind of these kind of funky, look like nightcaps. They wore red a lot with it. Union uniforms are just as varied as they were in the South. They were able to start standardizing their uniforms a lot better and a lot quicker because, remember, they have access to textile manufacturing. One really fascinating aspect about the Civil War is that you now have millions of men who need to be uniformed to go fight in a war. Before this, pretty much everything when you needed clothing had to be handmade, hand-tailored, or it was made at your house. Your wife would sew you a shirt if you needed one. If you lived out in the country, they would get some fabric together, make you a shirt. When the Civil War hits and they need to uniform large numbers of men, they have to come up with a sizing scheme. Your modern clothing sizing comes from the Civil War when they needed to come up with a system to size men to uniform. That is where the clothing sizes come from. Pretty fascinating little side tidbit. But you would see a variety of uniforms even on the Union side. And again, same thing with their flags. They would have handmade flags made by the people of their town. More often than not, units were raised up in a locality. One of their officers usually would be somebody that was well known. And if the officer that starts to run the army had enough money, they could pretty much outfit their troops in whatever uniforms they thought would be appropriate. Or if they were a militia organization, they would wear their militia uniforms. So, highly recommend kind of looking at that video. You'll just be you'll be awestruck by how many different uniforms are out there, and you're kind of going to think to yourself, how could anybody keep clear of anybody else of who's fighting out there? So one of the last things that's really critical that we talk about here is border states. Border states are the states that are right in the middle of the Union and the Confederacy. And they have to make a decision as to what side they are going to align on. For the most part, though, these states typically have slavery still in them, yet there's a split in society where there's a lot of commonality with the North and less commonality with the South. And one of the things that Lincoln has to do is try to find a balance to prevent these border states from leaving and going to the South. For one thing, if they leave, they double the population of the South. That gives them a whole lot more troops down in the South if they lose these border states. So Lincoln has to walk a fine line throughout the war when dealing with the border states themselves. If you ever want to know how critical these border states are, Lincoln has a famous line where he says, "I wish I had God on my side, but I need Kentucky." So he's well aware of what he needs in order to protect the Union. Another thing is these border states, they create a nice safe buffer to protect major northern manufacturing centers and also to protect Washington, D.C. If Maryland and Delaware leave, guess where Washington, D.C. now is? Right in the middle of the Confederate territory. And one of the things is that Maryland had some pretty pro-Confederacy groups within it. Not only that, there was a large number of members in their state government who were also very pro-Confederacy, and Lincoln literally had to bring the army, have it march through Maryland, intimidate those thinking about going to the South, and even arresting and jailing legislators. He suspends what is known as habeas corpus, which is basically meaning that he can arrest anybody he wants and detain them indefinitely without charging them with a crime. So this happens throughout the border state region too. You constantly had large numbers of Union troops moved into those territories to ensure that they stayed Union. If somebody was looking like they were planning on leaving, they would have had a heavy-handed tactic brought down upon them to ensure that they stayed in the Union. So this was pretty important. You'd think that with heavy-handedness that they would be even more willing to leave to the South, but there was, with the threat of military force, more often than not, people are willing to comply. So one of the things, though, too, is that African Americans, they were not initially allowed to join the military. Again, Lincoln is looking to not inflame tensions into the war as it was. And he didn't see this as a war of slavery. Instead, he saw it as a war to preserve the Union. That was his idea. That was his goal, was to save the Union. And he felt that if he tried to push this as a war against slavery, that he would lose a lot of support in the North, especially from the border states. He would lose support, and he wouldn't be able to maintain the military as he would need in a ready state. And there are problems with bringing African Americans into the military, and we're going to go over one of those things. It's known as the Fort Pillow Massacre, and we'll discuss what happens when African Americans are finally allowed to serve within the Union military. So initially, this is a war to preserve the Union, only a war to free the slaves. Does that come later and near the end of the war? It's so much so that at one point, John C. Fremont, remember Fremont, who runs for president and loses to Buchanan, Fremont is an ardent abolitionist, and when he's over the War Department in the West, he tries to issue his own version of an Emancipation Proclamation, and Lincoln comes down on him like a ton of bricks because he does not want to alienate those border states. All right, guys, that ends this section right here. When we come back on to Monday, we are going to go into strategies for factors, and then throughout the rest of the week, we are going to actually talk about battles of the Civil War. So we're going to get into actual fighting. All right, guys, thanks for joining me. Have yourself a good rest of the day.